There is a particular kind of dread that has nothing to do with failure. It visits the person who has done everything right, collected the credentials, earned the title, built the following, posted the proof. It arrives not in the wreckage of a life, but at the summit of one. You've climbed, and you're still climbing, and somewhere in the back of the mind a voice asks very quietly, "Is this it?" Picture someone, late 30s, maybe early 40s, who has spent the better part of a decade constructing a visible self. The promotions came, the apartment got bigger, the LinkedIn profile became a kind of monument. Every achievement was real, every milestone was earned, and yet each summit, when they finally reached it, opened onto another ridge. There was never a plateau where they could set down the weight and simply be. There was only the next thing that would finally make the life feel like it counted. This is not a private neurosis. It is the operating system of modern culture. Worth in the world we've built is measured in expansion, in reach, in scale, in the size of the footprint you leave. To simply be, quietly, particularly bounded to one life in one place, is coded as a kind of defeat. We have absorbed, without quite realizing it, the belief that a life only counts if it scales. That ordinary is another word for invisible. That if your story couldn't fill an auditorium, it wasn't really a story. But here is where something deeper begins to stir. Beneath the ambition, beneath the performance, there is the vast part of the mind operating below the surface, like the 90% of the iceberg you can't see. And in that hidden depth, something else is measuring. Not metrics, not reach, something that knows the difference between a life that has grown larger and a life that has grown real. This is where the process of becoming yourself begins. Not with a grand decision, but with that hollow feeling at the top of the ridge. That hollowness is not a flaw in the system. It is the system trying to tell you something. It is the deeper center of the whole personality. Not the everyday me, but the organizing intelligence behind the scenes. Registering that the direction you've been traveling is not the same as the direction you were meant to go. And here is where the culture intervenes with its ready answer. The hollowness you feel? That's a gap to be filled. The ridge that keeps opening onto another ridge? That's a ladder, and the solution is to climb faster. The spirit of this age is extraordinarily good at one thing. It frames every human limitation as a problem to be solved, every incapacity as an enemy to be slain. The whole machinery of self-improvement rests on this premise, that the you who cannot is simply a lesser version of the you who eventually will. Train harder, optimize better, rise. But there is something the age does not tell you, something it cannot afford to tell you, because the entire economy of striving depends on your not knowing it. Incapacity is not a temporary condition. It is part of the structure of being human. You will not get past it. You will not solve it. And the person who spends a life trying to eliminate every limitation, every inadequacy, every ordinary and embarrassing corner of themselves, that person does not become larger. They become less real. They become a project. And projects, however impressive, do not have souls. The deepest truths do not live at the summit. They live in the places that feel too small to matter. Consider the person who comes to a genuine turning point, not through revelation, but through something that embarrasses them to even admit. Not a crisis, not a breakdown, something banal. Maybe it's a conversation with a neighbor they've been quietly dismissing for years, someone who works an unremarkable job, who has never left the city they were born in, who talks about their garden with a quality of attention that feels almost indecent. And something stops, not dramatically, just stops. Because in that ordinary person, talking about an ordinary thing, there is a kind of settledness that the achiever has been chasing across a decade of summits and never found. That moment will feel like nothing. It will feel like the kind of thing you'd be embarrassed to tell a therapist, let alone put in a keynote. Pulp fiction. Small stuff. The kind of scene that gets cut from the story of an important life. But that moment is the doorway, because what is actually being encountered in that conversation is not just a neighbor. It is a part of the inner world that has been exiled. The part that doesn't scale. The part that finds meaning in the particular and the bounded, in the small and the habitual. The unconscious has been trying to surface this for years, and it couldn't get through the noise of the striving. So it waited for a quiet Tuesday afternoon and a person talking about tomatoes. This is also where something else appears, what you might call a complex, an old emotional wound that has grown its own voice. It doesn't just hurt, it argues back, and sometimes it runs your life. For the person who has been climbing, the complex often sounds like this. Ordinary is defeat. To be common is to be invisible. To stop ascending is to disappear. That voice is not a rational position. It is an old injury wearing the costume of a philosophy. And it has been making decisions that look like ambition but are actually fear. The antidote is not confidence. The people who are most certain of themselves, most cocksure about their direction and their greatness, those are often the ones most thoroughly lost. Certainty that sighs, that armored, is usually a sign that something underneath is terrified. The person who begins to find their way back is the one who can say, without shame, I don't entirely know. I am not sure I have this figured out. I am, in the most honest sense, common. That admission is not weakness. It is the beginning of something the age does not have a word for, that isn't condescending. Call it modesty, call it humility, not the performed kind, not the strategic kind, the real kind, which knows its own limits and finds in that knowing a strange relief, a peace that has nothing to do with achievement and nothing to do with scale. The ordinary is not a cage you escape on the way to your real life. It is the medium in which real life actually takes place. The hackneyed, the human, the quietly repeated, these are not obstacles to the deepest truths. They are where the deepest truths have always lived, waiting on everyone's lips for someone to climbing long enough to hear them. There is a young man, 25 maybe, who decides that the turning point in his life will look like a conquest. He has heard, somewhere in the language of self-improvement, that doing the inner work is a kind of project, and he is good at projects. He approaches it the way he has approached everything else, with a plan, with discipline, with the quiet expectation of a trophy at the end. He is going to climb this mountain the way he has climbed every other mountain. He is going to be very, very good at becoming himself. And then he dreams. He is on the mountain, literally on it, hauling himself up, and when he reaches the top there is no view. There is an altar, and on the altar there is a sarcophagus, and carved into the stone of the sarcophagus is his own face. He is looking at his own tomb. A veiled figure approaches carrying something that glows, and the young man wakes up and lies very still in the dark, not quite knowing what to do with what just happened to him. What the dream is telling him, in the language the unconscious has always used, is that the effort he is making is correct, but the posture is wrong. Climbing is fine, but what waits at the summit is not a trophy. It is a burial, and a burial, if you let it be what it is instead of running from it, is also a beginning. Here is the thing the culture never adequately explains about genuine transformation. It is not an achievement, it is an initiation, and the difference between those two things is not subtle. Achievement rewards the part of you that goes to work, checks its phone, and worries about what people think. The ego, the everyday operator of a human life, the thing that keeps score and sends emails and wants very badly to be seen as competent. Achievement says, you climbed, you won, here is your proof. Initiation says something else entirely. It says, put down the rope, stop hauling, submit. Submission of that kind is not passive. It is the hardest thing a person can do, precisely because everything in the modern formation of the self, every message absorbed since childhood about what it means to matter, argues against it. To stop ascending is coded as failure. To yield, to be brought low, to accept that you are less than you imagined yourself to be, these feel like defeat. They are not defeat. They are the door. The unconscious has always known this. In every culture's oldest stories, the hero eventually stops being the hero. There is a universal character that lives in every culture's stories, the hero, the trickster, the devouring mother. And what the hero's story almost always contains, buried beneath the victories, is a moment of radical undoing, a descent, a swallowing, a night in the belly of something vast and dark. The cultures that kept these stories intact understood something we have largely forgotten. You do not rise by continuing to rise. You rise by going down first, and by going down honestly, without the secret expectation of a medal for the descent. Climbing down is harder than climbing up. Anyone who has actually tried it knows this. physically, but also in every other sense. Going up, you can always tell yourself there is still more, still higher, still the thing that will finally make it real. Going down, you are confronted with what is actually there. And what is actually there, in the lowest regions of a person, tends to be embarrassing, childish, ridiculous. The parts of yourself you would never put in a keynote. The neediness, the pettiness, the fear of being ordinary that has been driving the ambition all along. And yet those parts, the small, the humiliating, the pathetic in the truest sense of the word, those are the ones that carry the actual weight of a human soul. Accepting them is not self-indulgence. It is the price of becoming real. The young man at the altar is not being asked to stop being himself. He is being asked to stop pretending to be more than he is, and to discover in that stopping that the lesser version he feared is not lesser at all. There is a particular danger on the other side of all that striving, of simply replacing one inflation with another. When someone gets swallowed by an archetype and starts to believe they are the hero, the savior, or the special one, mistaking the inner work itself for a new kind of glory. The one doing the inner work is a servant, not a master. The goal of the inner work does not belong to the ego. It comes through you. It is not produced by you. This is the strange geography of genuine inner life. The highest things are found not in the comfortable middle of a well-managed existence, but at the extremes, at the very top, which demands surrender, and at the very bottom, which demands acceptance. The eternal is stamped into both the heights and the depths. It is the lukewarm middle, the managed, the optimized, the carefully maintained surface life. That is where the deepest truths go silent. The person who wants to remain comfortable will remain, in the most important sense, untouched. And untouched is another word for unchanged. So what do you do with all of that? When you have finally admitted the limits, sat with the embarrassment, stopped hauling on the rope, you still have a Tuesday morning and a life to live in it. And here is where the temptation arrives, wearing a new disguise. Because the mind that has been trained for expansion does not simply stop expanding. It finds a new territory and expands into that. The inner work becomes the project. The process of becoming yourself becomes the new summit. And soon enough you are managing a very large garden, continent-sized, full of every insight and every dark night and every dream you have ever had, and none of it is tended well, because none of us has enough hands for a continent. There is an old image that keeps returning here, and it's worth sitting with. A small garden, well tended, is better than a large garden left to run wild. That's not a metaphor about lowering your ambitions. It's a statement about reality, about the difference between what you can actually hold in your hands and what you can only gesture at from a distance. The large garden looks more impressive from the road, but nothing is ripening in it. The weeds have swallowed the rows. The trees have grown beyond any shape that could bear fruit. Everything is as good as nothing, because nothing has been genuinely cared for. The image that follows from this is pruning, taking shears to everything that has grown beyond measure, not in self-punishment, not as a kind of spiritual austerity that is just ambition wearing a hair shirt, but as a return to what you can actually tend. This is where the real limits live, not the imagined ones, not the limits that other people put on you, not the ceiling installed by someone else's fear. The real ones, the ones that belong to you specifically, your soil, your stones, your particular angle of sun. You do not transcend those by ignoring them. You grow around them, and in growing around them, you become particular. You become, in the most precise sense, yourself rather than a general idea of a person. Think about a seed, a mountain pine, say, falling from its cone onto a specific patch of ground. That seed contains the whole future tree. Not a possible tree, not a tree contingent on conditions being perfect. The whole tree, in potential, is already there. But the tree that actually grows is not the generic pine. It is this pine, shaped by this stone it had to grow around, this slope it had to lean against, this particular shortage of water in its third summer. The constraints did not prevent the tree from becoming fully itself. The constraints were the means by which it became fully itself. And here is where something quiet becomes profound. When one person genuinely devotes themselves to the process of becoming themselves, not performing it, not broadcasting it, but actually doing it, Something happens in the people around them that has no adequate name. Not influence, not inspiration, exactly. Something more like a spark that leaps without being thrown. It happens when no words are used. It happens when the person has no intention of being exemplary. A quality of settledness moves through a room the way warmth moves through a room. You feel it before you could explain it, and you find yourself different afterward without quite knowing why. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. A single tree that bears fruit is not a small outcome. It is the whole purpose of the orchard. A life lived in its real dimensions, not scaled, not broadcast, just genuinely inhabited. That life sends something out into the world that the large gardens, the managed surfaces, the summit chasers never quite manage to send. It tends the small thing. And the small thing, tended faithfully, turns out to have been the real thing all along. And that realization, that the small thing faithfully tended turns out to be the real thing, points towards something that cannot be softened or made comfortable. Meaning is not distributed. It is not handed down by institutions or accumulated through collective effort. It lives, if it lives anywhere, in a single human being. Not in a movement, not in a nation, not in the aggregate of 1,000 like-minded people aligned behind a shared goal. In one person, bounded and particular, who has chosen to actually live their own life rather than a performance of it. Society is real. The way oxygen is real, the way water is real. You cannot survive without it. But it would be absurd to say that oxygen is the purpose of breathing. Society is the condition. The individual is the carrier. Happiness, depth, the experience of a life that actually means something. These cannot be felt by a country or a concept or a demographic. They can only be felt by a person, one person, the infinitesimal unit on whom somehow everything depends. And here is what that does not mean. It does not mean withdrawal. The person who is genuinely moved through the process of becoming themselves does not become sealed off. They become, paradoxically, more available, more present to other people, more capable of real contact, because they are no longer performing. The tree that bears fruit does not bear it for itself. Think of it this way. 1,000 trees grow in a valley, and most of them remain barren, shaped by wind, by fashion, by whatever the other trees are doing. One tree somehow bears fruit. That one tree is not a modest outcome. It is not a consolation prize for failing to become a forest. It is the whole point. The darkness of mere existence presses in from every direction, and the only answer that has ever worked is a single light, honestly kindled, held by a person who decided to be, without apology, exactly what they are.